On the 42nd day, Anatoly Kuznetsov asked Sergei Volkov to cut off his feet. They were black, frozen solid, and the smell had become unbearable. Volkov refused. Not because he was squeamish, but because he knew that without proper tools or medical supplies, the amputation would almost certainly kill his friend faster than the gangrene would. So instead, he wrapped the rotting flesh in strips of bark and kept feeding the fire. That is the kind of decision men make when they have been stranded in the Siberian taiga for 6 weeks with no rescue in sight. 47 days earlier, both men had been alive and whole, driving a loaded timber truck across a frozen river in the Sakha Republic. Now one of them could no longer walk, and the other had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in over a month. This is the story of how they got there, and how, against all reasonable expectation, both of them survived. The Sakha Republic, also known as Yakutia, occupies the northeastern corner of Siberia. It is one of the coldest inhabited regions on Earth. In winter, temperatures regularly fall below -50 degrees Celsius. Rivers freeze solid enough to support heavy vehicles. Roads disappear. Entire communities become unreachable for months at a time. Sergei Volkov and Anatoly Kuznetsov had worked together for nearly a decade. They were employed by a state logging operation based out of a small settlement called Zagansk, several hundred kilometers north of Yakutsk. In February 1994, they were assigned to transport a load of timber across the Lena River to a processing facility on the eastern bank. It was routine work. They had made the crossing dozens of times before. The ice that year had been thick and reliable, or so they believed. They set out on the morning of February 14th with a full load. The truck was a ZIL-131, a Soviet-era workhorse designed for harsh conditions. It weighed nearly 11 tons fully loaded. The first half of the crossing went smoothly. Then, approximately 2/3 of the way across, Volkov heard a sound he would never forget, a deep, groaning crack that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Before he could react, the rear of the truck dropped. The ice gave way beneath the back wheels, and the vehicle tilted sharply backward. Both men threw open their doors and scrambled out onto the fracturing ice. Behind them, the truck slid into the dark water and disappeared within seconds. They stood there, gasping in the frozen air, watching bubbles rise from the hole where their vehicle had been. Everything they needed to survive had been in that truck. Food. Tools. A radio. Spare clothing. Fuel. All of it was now at the bottom of the Lena River, buried under several meters of freezing water and broken ice. What they had left was what they were wearing, padded work jackets, felt-lined boots, wool hats, and gloves. No matches. No knife. No food. Volkov checked his pockets and found a cigarette lighter. It was almost out of fuel, but it worked. That lighter would save their lives. They stood on the ice for several minutes, stunned and silent, the reality of their situation slowly taking hold. They were approximately 120 kilometers from the nearest settlement. There were no roads through this section of taiga. No other vehicles would be crossing the river until spring. No one would come looking for them for at least 2 days, and even then, search parties would have no idea where to begin. The temperature was already dropping as the afternoon light faded. Volkov estimated it was -35 Celsius. By nightfall, it would be colder. They could not stay on the river. They had to find shelter, and they had to find it quickly. Volkov pointed toward the eastern bank, where the tree line was thicker. They began walking. The first night nearly killed them. They pushed into the forest until the light was gone, then stopped in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines. The snow was waist deep. They had no tools to cut wood, so they broke dead branches from trees with their bare hands, snapping what they could, kicking larger limbs until they cracked. It took over an hour to gather enough for a fire. Volkov's lighter produced only a weak spark at first. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. On the 5th attempt, a flame caught on a handful of dry pine needles. They fed it carefully, adding twigs, then larger sticks, then branches. The fire grew. They huddled beside it, their backs against a fallen log, and waited for morning. Neither man slept. The cold was relentless. It seeped through their clothing, through their skin, into their bones. Every few minutes, one of them would stand and stamp his feet or swing his arms just to keep blood moving. By dawn, Kuznetsov's toes had gone numb. He said nothing about it. There was nothing to be done. When the gray light finally returned, they took stock of their situation. They had fire. They had shelter of a sort. They had each other. Beyond that, they had nothing. Over the following days, they built a shelter. It was crude work, fallen logs stacked against a living tree, branches woven between them, the whole structure packed with snow for insulation. The entrance faced away from the prevailing wind. Inside, there was just enough room for both men to lie side by side. They lined the floor with pine boughs to keep their bodies off the frozen ground. It was not warm, but it held heat better than the open air. The fire became the center of their existence. They kept it burning constantly, taking turns through the night to feed it. Gathering fuel consumed most of their daylight hours. They ranged further and further from the shelter as the nearest deadfall was exhausted, dragging branches through the snow, breaking what they could, piling it near the entrance. Food was the immediate crisis. By the third day, hunger had become a constant presence, a hollow ache that never faded. They tried eating pine bark, stripping it from trees and chewing the inner layer. It was bitter and fibrous, nearly impossible to swallow, but it gave them something to put in their mouths. Kuznetsov remembered a technique from his army days, setting snares for small game. They had no wire, so they improvised with strips torn from their clothing. The snares worked. On the fifth day, they caught their first hare, a small, thin animal, barely enough meat for one meal between two men. But it was food. Real food. They skinned it clumsily with sharpened sticks and roasted it over the fire. They ate everything, including the organs, cracking the bones afterward to suck out the marrow. It was the first protein either of them had consumed in nearly a week. Over the following days, they caught more, another hare, a few squirrels, once a small bird that had wandered into a snare meant for larger prey. None of it was enough. They were burning more calories gathering wood and checking traps than they were consuming. Their bodies began to consume themselves. But the snares kept them alive. Meanwhile, Kuznetsov's condition was deteriorating. The numbness in his toes had spread. By the end of the first week, both feet had turned white and waxy, the unmistakable signs of deep frostbite. He could no longer feel them at all. Walking became difficult, then painful, then nearly impossible. He began staying in the shelter while Volkov gathered wood and checked the snares alone. He did not complain. He simply sat by the fire, staring at his useless feet, knowing what was coming. By the third week, Kuznetsov's feet had turned black. The tissue was dying. The smell was impossible to ignore, a sickly sweet rot that filled the shelter and clung to their clothing. Volkov tried to keep the wounds clean, but there was nothing to clean them with. He packed them with snow to numb the pain and wrapped them in strips of fabric torn from his own shirt. It was not treatment. It was just delay. Kuznetsov knew he was dying. He told Volkov to leave him behind, to walk out alone while he still had the strength. Volkov refused. They argued about it, quietly at first, then with more heat. Kuznetsov called him a fool. Volkov called him worse. In the end, nothing changed. Volkov kept gathering wood. He kept checking the snares. He kept feeding his friend whatever scraps of meat they caught. And at night, he lay beside him in the shelter, listening to his labored breathing, wondering how long either of them had left. The days blurred together. Snow fell. The fire burned. The forest remained silent and indifferent. Somewhere out there, people were looking for them. But neither man knew that. For all they knew, they had been forgotten. They had been reported missing on the third day after their scheduled return. A search party had been organized out of Zagansk, but the scale of the wilderness made the effort almost futile. The men could have been anywhere within 1,000 square kilometers of frozen taiga. Helicopters flew when weather permitted, but blizzards grounded them for days at a time. Ground teams on snowmobiles covered the main routes and river crossings, finding nothing. After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back. Resources were limited. Other emergencies demanded attention. The families were told that recovery efforts would continue when conditions improved, but the unspoken message was clear: no one expected to find Volkov and Kuznetsov alive. What the searchers did not know was that the two men had drifted nearly 8 kilometers east of the river during their first night in the forest. They were well outside the primary search zone. The helicopter that passed over them on day 19 flew too far north to spot their shelter. Volkov heard the distant thrum of its rotors and stumbled out into the snow, waving his arms and shouting. But the sound faded, and the sky remained empty. He stood there for a long time, arms at his sides, staring at nothing. On the 42nd day, Kuznetsov asked Volkov to cut off his feet. The gangrene had spread past his ankles. The smell had become unbearable, even in the freezing air. Kuznetsov could no longer move at all. He lay in the shelter, drifting in and out of consciousness, his body slowly poisoning itself. He said the words calmly, almost casually, as if asking for a cup of water. Volkov refused. He had no blade, no way to stop the bleeding, no means of preventing infection. Amputation would mean death, just faster. So he did what he had been doing for 6 weeks. He wrapped the rotting flesh in fresh bark. He fed the fire. He melted snow for water and dribbled it into his friend's cracked lips. And he waited. He no longer expected rescue. He no longer thought about the future at all. He simply existed, 1 hour at a time, doing what needed to be done because there was nothing else to do. The forest had become his entire world. The shelter, the fire, the snares, the slow rhythm of survival, these were the only things that remained. Everything else had faded into abstraction. His wife. His children. His life before the ice broke. All of it felt like a dream he had once had, long ago. The helicopter found them on the 47th day. A pilot running a supply route to a remote weather station had drifted slightly off course and spotted smoke rising from the forest. He circled once, then twice, unsure of what he was seeing. When he saw a figure stumble out of the trees and collapse in the snow, he radioed for an emergency extraction. The rescue team arrived within hours. They found Volkov lying face down where he had fallen, too weak to stand but still breathing. Inside the shelter, Kuznetsov was unconscious, his body skeletal, his feet wrapped in blood-soaked bark. Both men were airlifted to a hospital in Yakutsk. Volkov weighed less than 50 kilograms, he had lost nearly a third of his body weight. Kuznetsov was in septic shock. Doctors amputated 6 of his toes over the following weeks. He survived. Against every reasonable expectation, both of them survived. Volkov returned to Zagansk the following autumn. He never worked as a logger again. Kuznetsov moved south to live with relatives. The two men stayed in contact for many years, speaking occasionally by telephone, never discussing what had happened in detail. Some things do not need to be said between men who have kept each other alive for 47 days in the Siberian wilderness. The forest does not remember them. The river has frozen and thawed dozens of times since that February in 1994. But somewhere in the taiga, if you know where to look, there are still traces, a collapsed structure of rotting logs, a scattering of old bones, the faint outline of a fire pit that burned without stopping for 6 weeks. The land keeps its own records, even when the men who made them are gone.